All right, today we're going to be concluding the great series that Josh has preached all the way through to this until this point, that we've been calling Follow. And we're going to finish it off by looking at what it means to flourish as a follower of Jesus. Some of you will have heard some of this message yesterday if you were at the Fresh conference. 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was sitting in a backyard watching some kids play. Emma's smiling already. And there was on the back of the patio, there was one of those canvas swings that you can screw into the patio. Have you seen those? They're really great. They take up to about 70 kilos and they're undercover there. And the little 2-year-old was playing on this. She had her tummy over the cloth swing and she was using her feet to push her. And she had her arms out like this. She was like she was flying. She spent ages on the swing. And I was watching her. I was sitting on a comfy outdoor piece of furniture and watching her swing, watching the other kids in the distance. And I watched this little 2-year-old suddenly spot a green plastic seesaw, you know, one of those tiny little ones that one child can manipulate and rock herself. And she jumped off the swing and she ran over to the seesaw and she said, rock, 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 rock. And then I saw that the 3.5-year-old who was playing down the back of the yard noticed that the swing was now empty. I could stop just there. You could play this thing out in your mind. And I watched as the 2-year-old clocked the 3.5-year-old running to the swing. 2-year-old is off that seesaw like it's the worst thing she's ever seen, races to the swing also, and they arrived at the exact same time, grabbed a handle each, and they started screaming like they were auditioning for a horror movie. And the little one, the 2-year-old, is just yelling, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. And she's hanging onto the swing and she's reaching back, would you believe, with her other hand to get the seesaw as well. Because you can see on her face, she's suddenly thinking, oh my goodness, people take your stuff. And the 3.5-year-old, who's got the benefit of 18 more months of life and the maturity that goes with that, she has learnt something about sharing. She's screaming also, and she's screaming, that's not fair, it's my turn. And she'd learnt the wisdom of those sorts of things, of sharing, because she was that little bit older. And as I walked over towards the girls to try and stop any blood actually being shed on the paving bricks, it occurred to me that perspective is very powerful. Perspective is very influential. It's very persuasive. It's very powerful. It was evident in that little interaction there. And then as I was preparing actually for a talk I gave yesterday and for the sermon today, it started to occur to me that we'd probably bring a whole pile of perspective to this word flourish. I want to talk today about what it means to flourish as a follower of Jesus. But I bet there's a whole pile of perspective in this room about what it means to flourish. So take 20 seconds, and I want you to actually first of all take 10 seconds and think, what's a word, a feeling, or an image that comes to your mind when you see or hear the word flourish? And then share it with someone sitting next to you. Okay. So I imagine there were probably a lot of similarities in some of the words that you were using, but maybe some differences as well. And I want to start with one perspective. This is a traditional perspective on the word flourish, really, the dictionary definition of the word flourish. To flourish, the dictionary tells us, is to prosper or do well, is to be in a period of highest productivity, of excellence or influence. It's to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way, especially as the result of a particularly congenial environment. Now, I've got to say, when I hear flourishing described like this, I think, yeah, I am up for flourishing in this way. I am up for being, what are some of the things there? Productive and excellent and person of influence. I'm prepared and ready to be grown and develop vigorously. You know, I want to be highly productive. I am available for flourishing in a particularly congenial environment. Don't you love that phrase? A particularly congenial environment. Yes, please. Is that how home felt this morning? Maybe it did for some of you, maybe not for some others. Is that how you would describe your week, a particularly congenial environment? Is that a phrase you would use to describe your life in particular? Now, I want to say that for those of you that are nodding yes, that's great. I want to celebrate this morning the fact that some of us do feel like we're flourishing at the moment, thriving as followers of Jesus, and in no small part because of the congeniality, the agreeableness, if you like, of the environment that we find ourselves in. So we'll celebrate that today for sure. We'll honour God and admire people and respect people and thank God for the flourishing that happens in those agreeable, congenial places for sure. But we're also going to take a look at the idea of being able to flourish in an environment that you might not consider quite as congenial or a likely place for people to flourish. So I want to look at flourishing from another perspective. And that perspective is actually been recorded for us in some words written long, long ago by a man called Jeremiah, words that he recorded that were attributed to God. And he said these things. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord and have made the Lord their hope and confidence. They are like trees planted along a riverbank with roots that reach deep into the water. Such trees are not bothered by the heat or worried by long months of drought. Their leaves stay green and they never stop producing fruit. Now, I hope you can see, just having a quick read of that or a quick listen to that, a little hint of a slightly different perspective. Okay, given the trees are on a riverbank, and you might say to yourself, well, that sounds very congenial. But if you have a look at what's going on there for that riverbank, you'll see that they're planted on the river's edge in the middle of seemingly endless heat and ongoing months and months and months of drought. So nice setting. But actually what's going on around is actually really, really very tough. The river has dried up almost to nothing, and the searing heat is relentless. But the trees are not afraid of the heat. And in this year of drought, the trees are not anxious. That's how another version that records this story describes the trees, with those phrases, not afraid, not anxious. And in all the versions where you read this story, they talk about the fact that in that drought environment, the leaves on the tree are still green and the tree is still producing the fruit it was designed to produce. So I want to ask, what is going on here? Why are these trees flourishing in the long, hot, dry season that they find themselves in? And more pressingly, really, what does that say to us? How can we, as followers of Jesus, how can we flourish? How can we be like the trees when our environment is less than congenial? When we feel like we're in a year of drought, maybe another year of drought. Now, what I love about this whole book of Jeremiah, and what I love about these two verses, is that the truth in those words and the answer to those questions about why those trees are flourishing and how we can flourish, they're actually reflected in the life of the man who had the words recorded. If you've got the time to read the whole story of Jeremiah, you'll see that. Now, he lived some 2,500 years ago, and he was a prophet, which meant that his job was to take a message from God about what mattered to God to the people of God. And you know, what mattered to God back then is what matters to God today and what matters to God always. What matters to God is how we are doing relationally. How we are doing in relationship with Him, how we are doing in relationship with ourselves, how we are doing in relationship with each other and with all of the created world. That's put very simply, but that's what matters to God. Always has. Always will, relationship. So Jeremiah, he was sent to give the people whom God called his own people a little bit of an update on how they were doing with what matters to God, relationship. And even if you don't know the story, you can probably guess he wasn't sent with good news. See, at the time when Jeremiah lived, when this story takes place, the people whom God called his own, they were in a very bad way. And many of them had been killed or dispersed into other nations, absorbed into other nations. And those that were left were living in the kingdom of Judah. And God said to Jeremiah, go to those that are left and tell them it's not long for them. They're going to go the way of their brother kingdom Israel very soon. Because sometime earlier, Israel had been destroyed politically, geographically, economically, socially. effectively because of bankruptcy in their relationship. Bankruptcy in their relationship with God. Because you see, God had made a covenant with them, an agreement with them, a promise with them, and God had said to them, I will love you perfectly, consistently, faithfully, always. I will be with you. You will thrive. You will flourish in relationship with me. And what I want from you, he said, is love me back and show that love in the way that you relate with other people. Show that love by living out my good ways. But the people chose to dismiss God's love, which maybe didn't seem like so much of a thing, but they dismissed this and it leaked into this. The bankruptcy that was happening here soon started to colour their other relationships as well. So I tell you all that to tell you that is the world that Jeremiah was born into. And as a young man, sometime in his 30s, for 40 years until he was killed, murdered in his 70s, this was the job that he had to do. He took a message about a broken covenant and relational bankruptcy to people who did not care to hear. That's a long time to do a very difficult thing. And I'm kind of using him as a poster boy for flourishing. Long time to do a very difficult thing. And I tell you, we know more about Jeremiah's life than any other prophet in the Bible. And his was a lonely and a high-risk life. As a grown-up, as an adult, he had no family of his own. That was part of the arrangement God had with him, that he wouldn't get married and wouldn't have kids. His family of origin, well, they obviously weren't all on side because some of them were part of one of the many plots to kill Jeremiah. So, it's not like he necessarily had a great home to go back to and get some support. Did he have friends? There's probably 3 people that you might think about as being his friends. There were 3 people, or 4, but 3 of them turned up at times in his life when he actually needed physical rescue. But I don't know, you can use only part of the fingers on one hand to count them. And I'm not sure, I'm very sure really, that they weren't friends in the sense of, it's Friday night, I'm at a loose end, want to come over, let's have pizza, watch telly. They were there in a moment of crisis, but not friends in the way that you and I might understand. And his best friend, this was really awkward, his best friend, if you like, was a guy from work. And we all know how tricky that could be. I'm sure you've got some great friendships in your workplace, but his best buddy was his secretary, a guy from work. So it was a lonely life for him. When it came to flourishing, you couldn't say that Jeremiah's environment was particularly congenial. He had a couple of other names beside Jeremiah. He was called the weeping prophet. And he was also called the prophet of doom. You're getting a bit of a picture for, oh great, shall we have the prophet of doom over for dinner this weekend? Yeah, maybe not. Oh good, the weeping prophet's in town. That's going to be a great week. So his story is full of heartache, okay? And the environment he was in was difficult. The job he had to do was difficult. And then, because we know so much about Jeremiah, we get quite a look into his personality too. And I have to say, he was not your classic flourisher type personality. He was really given to self-analysis and self-criticism, which makes many of us like him a whole lot more. We're very comfortable with that. Someone else like that. He was heavily into that. He looked inside all the time. Oh my goodness, how am I doing? Am I doing the right thing? How am I going there? He was naturally timid. The first chapter of Jeremiah, verse 6 particularly, you see that very clearly. And he was afraid. He was afraid to the point often of wishing that he hadn't been born. You read that in chapter 15, verse 10. And he was, a lot of the time, deeply conflicted about many things, including his relationship with God. And he said this at one stage, your help seems as uncertain, he's talking to God, your help seems as uncertain as a seasonal brook, they come and go. And like a spring that has gone dry. So can you see this? Jeremiah's environment was not particularly congenial for flourishing. And you know what? In his personality, he wasn't predisposed. He wasn't possessed, okay? He did not hear that here this day. He wasn't predisposed at all to, by good genes or some amazing nurture or the great support group he had around him to, by sheer force of personality, flourish in spite of. You see people like that. He wasn't one of those sorts of people. And yet here we are talking about Jeremiah generations later, and not because he turned out to be a horrible warning. Sometimes we talk about people from history because they've been a horrible warning, and it's good for us to remember. That's not actually why, in spite of the story I've just told you, we're talking about Jeremiah. We're talking about Jeremiah because his story is an awesome example of a person living a life of great and good influence. I hope you will see. Not in the conventional sense. I can't swing the story around and say he became a national hero and they gave him a state funeral when he died, etc. He was stoned to death for bringing this message. Yeah, that's right. As you can see why I picked him as a flourisher. It's clearly very obvious. Okay. But I want to say that his is the story of a man who knew what mattered. This is what we're getting to here. You see, even with all the heartache in his life, Jeremiah knew, and I can't describe this knowing enough. He knew, I'm sure, with his mind. He knew with his heart. He knew with his soul. He knew with his whole being some things about God, the God that he had a relationship with. He knew that God is the creator and sustainer of life. He knew God, he describes God in various ways in this book as a fountain of living water, as the one who defines the ocean's sandy shoreline, as a giver and taker of breath. So Jeremiah knew that about God. And Jeremiah knew with all his being that God is personally active for our good. That's really important. Personally active for your good, for mine, for yours, but it doesn't stop there. Personally active for the good of our community, personally active for the good of all of human history, of all of creation, always moving everything towards God's good plans, whatever we might be doing. And Jeremiah had more than one occasion to go, what the heck is going on here? What is God doing? But he knew that God was personally active for our good, individually and together. He knew God to be merciful and loyal and faithful. A whole pile of other things as well. But you know what? I think the most important thing that Jeremiah knew is that he knew God to be love. And that's pretty awesome, actually, when you consider the life that Jeremiah had. But he knew God to be love. He records these words, again attributed to God. Long ago, the Lord said to Israel, I have loved you, my people, with an everlasting love. With unfailing love, I have drawn you to myself. What beautiful, beautiful words. And you know, so Jeremiah, timid, self-critical, choose someone else Jeremiah, he became a man God made brave, saying to him, for see, today I have made you strong, like a fortified city that cannot be captured, like an iron pillar or a bronze wall. For I am with you, and I will take care of you. I, the Lord, have spoken. They're not actually hard words to believe sitting in the probably over-warm room. I reckon they were pretty tough words for Jeremiah to believe at some stages in his life. And I'm sure, looking out, I know some of us have found those words hard to believe at some stages in our life. But Jeremiah believed that to be true. Okay, now remember the trees on the riverbank that we started with a little earlier. If you've got a Bible or a Bible app with you there and you scroll up a few verses, you'll see that there's mention of shrubs. And they are not described anywhere near as flatteringly as the trees are. They are stunted shrubs in the desert who had no hope for the future. Yeah, I know which description I'd prefer. Stunted shrubs in the desert with no hope for the future. And you know what the difference is? This is seen I'm not a Hebrew scholar, I only did Greek, didn't do Hebrew, but the Hebrew scholars tell me that this is in the language of the words that is used. The difference between the shrubs and the trees is that the trees on the riverbank were actively pushing their roots down. Oh, now I sound like the Coles ad. Give me the big red hand. Is it? It just came out. They were actively pushing their roots down into the groundwater. That was something that they were doing different, actively different to what the shrubs in the desert were doing. So I want to say these trees weren't flourishing because everything was green and beautiful around them. because they had a lovely environment, but they weren't flourishing by accident either. They were doing something, they were intentional, and it was the same with Jeremiah. He was not a man of influence by the chance of, good circumstance or happy accident. Jeremiah flourished because, like the trees on the riverbank, he knew what mattered, and he pushed down. I only say it once this time, so you stay with me. He pushed down into his relationship with God. So as Jeremiah lived his life, and I think this is really important that you hear this, as Jeremiah lived his life, not because he attended a brilliant conference, not because he heard a life-changing sermon, not because he went to a fantastic retreat or a camp or a weekend away. All those things are great and you should do them. But as Jeremiah lived his life in the everyday, he learned that God will chase down anything, absolutely anything, that stands in the way of you experiencing the life-changing love of our Father God. He'll chase down anything. Jeremiah learnt that by getting up every morning and living with his roots deep in his relationship with God. Now, of course, Jeremiah didn't know Jesus. Jesus wasn't born till hundreds of years after Jeremiah died. But I love to imagine this. I imagine if somebody could have said to Jeremiah when he was alive, do you know what? God is going to chase us down so hard that he's going to come and actually be with us in this guy called Jesus. I can imagine Jeremiah going, sounds about right. Sounds like something my God would do. Sounds like something the creator of the universe, who doesn't want anything to stand in the way of his life-changing love, would do to help us to see how much he loves us. And of course, we know that is what Jesus did. I love that description of Jesus as God with us and God for us, loving us with all that he is so that you and I can live love-shaped and hope-filled lives that are free of anxiety and free of fear, regardless of the circumstances we find ourselves in. That's a tall ask, I know, but it's what's on offer. When I was a young woman, I spent a lot of energy, a lot of mental, physical, emotional energy striving to organise a congenial environment in which to thrive. I subscribed to what you might call the ducks in a row philosophy of life. If I could just get the ducks lined up, then I'd be successful in my marriage, my parenting, my relationship with God. I'd be successful in the work and the volunteering and other things that I did. The ducks needed to be in a row, so I worked really hard to get the external things looking neat and tidy, and I worked even harder probably to keep the internal, unattractive, difficult emotions that I was feeling quiet, so I could be busy sorting out the things on the outside and getting those ducks lined up beautifully. And for me, some of you know this already, it was a long period, many years of severe postnatal depression that helped me to start to see what actually matters. And I realised, to borrow a Facebook meme that I love, just to be clear, Facebook wasn't invented back when I was a young woman, so at the time it wasn't there to help me, but later on in life when I came to saw this meme on Facebook, I thought, yeah, that's what it is. That's what I started to realise back there. I realised I don't have ducks, guys. Don't be hoping, don't be planning on that, and they are certainly not in a row. You know what I've got? I've got squirrels, and they are at a rave. Oh my goodness. No ducks, no rows, squirrels at a rave. And what actually mattered was me letting go of my hankering after neatly lined up ducks and doing three things instead. So letting actually practicing trust and putting my hope and confidence in God by doing three things. Here's the first thing I had to learn to do. I had to learn to live my actual life. My real life, not this life that you see on the platform, the life that when I'm down there and out there in the world, my real actual life, not a life of my imagining or my hankering after. I had to learn to live my actual life where it was, and it changes, there's different seasons. I had to learn to live it hanging on tight to Jesus, who loves me completely and forever. And then letting that love, that generous, inexhaustible love, colour and shape my relationships as best I could, even in those years of depression, even in other tough seasons, in the good seasons as well. And I don't say that in a way to put false pressure or unreasonable pressure, but just making that shift in my head. In this situation of depression or heartache with a child, how does the love that keeps me, how am I expressing that in the situations that I find myself in? About that, and I remember something my dad told me that he used to do when he was a pastor. He was a pastor for many decades. When he visited people in hospital and they were followers of Jesus, and it was appropriate, he didn't walk in and do this inappropriately, he would always find a time, or often find a time, to say to that person, so how is this ward different because you as a follower of Jesus are in it today? Or he might say to them, okay, so this is your world this week, this month, sometimes longer for some people. How are you hanging on to Jesus and letting his love colour the relationships you have in this situation? Has today been better for the staff because you're a patient here as a Jesus follower? And it occurred to me that my dad is practicing the thing he has preached for decades. He's living his real and actual life, hanging on tight to the God that he knows loves him forever and completely, and letting that love colour his relationships with his wife, who can't communicate with him much anymore, with all the other people, the other 80 people that he lives with in this place. If I got my dad up on the stage, if I got some of the women I talked about yesterday up on the platform, many others of you whose stories I know, you might not look at those people and go, oh my goodness, now there's someone who's flourishing. There's someone with their ducks in a row. I think you probably wouldn't. And certainly if my dad was up here, you wouldn't look at him and go, oh, well, it makes sense. Look at his personality. He's charismatic and he's, type A. He's bound to flourish. He's not like that. And many of the women the people that I would probably invite to stand up on here, you wouldn't look at them and think to yourself, oh, well, it makes sense. It makes sense because of their environment, or it makes sense because of their personalities. But I tell you what, you would, without a doubt, see followers of Jesus who learnt some of the things that Jeremiah learnt, who believe that God is creator and sustainer of life, that God is personally involved in our lives and in all of this life, who believe God is loyal and faithful and merciful, and who know God to be love. I want to suggest, as we come to the end of this series on as followers of Jesus, following Jesus, maybe today is a day that you need to start to look at what it means to flourish as a Jesus follower from a different perspective. Remember the two girls in the swing? Both very passionate about their perspectives, two very different perspectives. Do you need a different perspective? Perhaps don't scream loudly or threaten to kill anyone over it, but, do you need a different perspective? Maybe today is your day for that. And if you think it is, and I can guarantee you a couple of things, I bet for many of us, if we need to change our perspective about what it means to flourish, that we're first of all going to have to let go of some false expectation about what flourishing looks like. The second thing I want to say is we probably need to stop and give ourselves a little pat on the back. You are quite possibly full of greener leaves and more fruit than you realise. And if you stop comparing yourself or going by false expectations, you'll go, hang on a minute, I've got green leaves. I've got some fruit happening here. And for some of us, this perspective change is probably going to mean the hard work of getting honest with God and a safe person or two about just how dry and hot the environment is that you are living in. That sometimes has to be a first step that you take towards being able to live the life you have to the full. So you could do any of those things. Decide on a new perspective. Adjust your expectations. Acknowledge the ways in which you are already flourishing as a follower of Jesus. And have the courage, I guess, to name with God and with someone that's safe for you to do that with the things that make you anxious and afraid. There's 4 very practical things. But I want to tell you one more as we come to a close. I've told you that my personality, left to my own defaults, I'm naturally inclined to a ducks in a row philosophy of life. quite honestly, if you said to me now, Karen, good news, we can suddenly give you the choice, I would choose the ducks over the squirrels, okay? But, that's an inclination, but I've lived a lot more with squirrels than ducks in my years. And I find that over my years, my perspective has shifted, and more, I find myself praying something like this. Have a listen. I find myself praying, Jesus, would you help me accept the freedom of flourishing in my real and everyday life, instead of living the half-life of my fanciful yearning. And Jesus, through the powerful presence of your Spirit, will you help me when the squirrels are on the rampage? Will you help me stay sure and close with you? And Jesus, will you free me to love the people where I have influence with kind and faithful love like yours? That's the kind of thing I find myself praying more often, pining after ducks, praying to be able to live life to the full with the squirrels. So maybe that's the fifth thing. Maybe you might make a prayer like that, your own today. Look full into the face of Jesus. See the love in his eyes. Feel the warmth of his embrace. And listen. Listen to his voice. Today I have made you strong, for I am with you, and I will take care of you.